This sitting is resumed.
Mr. President, order number 2, in the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the second reading of the Debt Conversion Counter Guarantee Bill 2022.
Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. This is a short but important bill which is before this honorable chamber. Mr. President, I don't think that I would have to share with any of the members of this honorable chamber or anyone in the public space that the question of debt and debt management is a source of conversation which the government of Barbados has been deeply involved in, both internal to the apparatus of government and externally with its development partners, as well as with our financing partners. And so, Mr. President, I am sure that when I move a motion to discuss something called the Debt Conversion Bill, it does generate some conversation and it does attract some attention. Because the question obviously is, and the first and the most logical thing most want to know is, what is it? What is it about? What is the government attempting to do? What are we hoping to accomplish with this measure? And how does this measure address the issues that are of concern to us? Now, Mr. President, I want to start by putting this in a policy framework, first of all, by looking at what is contained within the specifics of the bill before this honorable chamber. It is a short bill, Mr. President. It is 7 clauses only, but it speaks specifically to what is the purpose of the bill. And the purpose of the bill, the primary purpose of this bill, is to authorize the government of Barbados, as outlined at Clause 3, to enter into counter guarantee agreements in respect of debt in order to facilitate the execution of programs in 3 main areas. And those 3 main areas are environmental, economic, and social development. That is the primary purpose of this bill. But what does that mean, Mr. President, in real terms? Mr. President, let me start by saying, first of all, that in the last administration, the last term of this administration, the 2018 period, there was an entity known as the Ministry of Maritime Affairs and the Blue Economy. That entity, that ministry, has since been folded into the Ministry of Environment to treat with both the blue and the green economy, Mr. President. Now, what is that going to do in this incarnation, Mr. President? I believe that the Ministry of Maritime Affairs and the Blue Economy achieved a level of recognition globally because it was the first of its kind anywhere. It was the first time that we had elevated the attention being paid to the blue economy to the level of having a dedicated ministry. And why would we do that as an administration, Mr. President? It is known that Barbados' natural capital is about 424 times larger in terms of its ocean mass, is 425 times larger than our land mass. It means that there is more water around us that is under the jurisdiction of Barbados than there is land mass, Mr. President. And so it is only fitting and appropriate that a government that is interested in transformation, that is interested in development, and that has prioritized the 3 things of which I just spoke, environmental, social, and economic development, would attempt to treat to that land, that water mass, in the same way that we have historically treated to the development of our land mass. And it is on that basis, Mr. President, that we have subsequently developed in the last term of this administration, a blue economy roadmap. That roadmap, Mr. President, outlines how Barbados as an administration, as a country, is going to develop a national marine spatial plan, how we are going to allow for sustainable utilization of resources, how we are going to increase the total area that is available for marine protected areas. And I believe that the minister at the time for Maritime Affairs would have outlined what some of those areas would be, and how we will allow for the expansion of institutionalized support for ecosystem-based fisheries management. And on that basis, Mr. President, the government of Barbados, and I believe that I have just laid earlier today as documents of this House, the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, and this is a direct correlation, Mr. President, to the work being done in this particular bill. And so we have here that there are a number of elements included in the plan for the blue economy, and they include three main areas. One, I just mentioned, the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, how we go about sensitizing key stakeholders to the plan, to the process, and then thirdly, how we increase the areas under sustainable use and management for the benefit of all. So, Mr. President, these are the contextual frameworks within this particular work is being done. And so how does this then lend itself to Barbados developing a framework that is going to be called something like a debt conversion guarantee bill? How is this all connected, Mr. President? Mr. President, right now, around the world, there are approximately 40 countries who have developed what we call conservation funds. They have developed conservation funds, Mr. President, because they recognize that there is a responsibility to preserve, to conserve, and to develop in sustainable mechanisms, using sustainable mechanisms. And Barbados now is going to be among those countries, 40 countries in the world, over a 30-year period. Barbados is going to now be, proposed to be, among those countries of the world that establishes a fund and a mechanism that allows us to invest in the sustainable management of our resources. Now, this is not work that has just started. This is work that has begun and has been underway over the period of December 2021 into 2022 until May. There have been meetings with all of the stakeholders, all of the partners, all of the development agencies have had an opportunity to weigh into this, Mr. President. And on that basis, a draft framework has been developed. Now, there's also a level of what this is going to be capitalized at, and I think it is a mark of confidence, Mr. President, that initially it was earmarked that the government of Barbados would look for the guarantee for operational and technical cooperation in partnership with the Inter-American Development Bank and the Nature Conservancy, TNC, we will call it later on, for approximately $100 million. That sum has since, Mr. President, been increased to $150 million, with the Inter-American Development Bank guaranteeing $100 million and with the TNC guaranteeing $50 million, Mr. President. And so that is, I believe, a vote of confidence in the government of Barbados and in this particular initiative. Now, what is the initiative? There are two specific objectives of this initiative. One, strengthening the institutional framework to support sustainable finance and adequate natural resource management. And secondly, improving debt management capacity with a focus on environmental and financial sustainability. And there are three components within the program. And this is just the in principle, these are just the in principle components that we're seeing here so far. The first component, Mr. President, is macroeconomic stability, sustainability. The second component is about strengthening institutional capacity to finance the blue and sustainable economy. And that would include things, Mr. President, like developing and enabling an environment for sustainable investments, to create a sustainable trust fund for investing in the blue and the sustainable economy. And thirdly and finally, Mr. President, improving the Barbados debt management institutional framework and capacities by doing two principal things. Strengthening the debt management institutional framework in the first instance, and secondly, developing new instruments to improve sustainability. These are just the high-level views that I have given you of what is incorporated in the policy expectation for this particular initiative. But there is the expectation that a full matrix will be developed in collaboration with the partners, the government of Barbados, the Ministry of Environment, including the blue and the green economy, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Nature Conservancy, and all of the other partners who have done this globally, who have expressed an interest in working with Barbados to develop these mechanisms, Mr. President, that we will have the development of a full, what we call verification matrix to ensure that that which is designed is used for that specific purpose. Now, Mr. President, I think one of the things that I want to draw the attention of the Honourable Chamber to, because we talk a lot of times about things relating to transparency and accountability and ensuring that the members of the public, and starting first of all with members of the Parliament, are in possession of what the government has committed to. And I would wish to draw to the attention of the members here the provisions of the Counter Guarantee Agreement at Clause 4, Paragraph 3. A copy of every Counter Guarantee Agreement shall be laid before Parliament within 30 days of the conclusion of that agreement, or if Parliament does not sit within that time, within 30 days after the commencement of its next sitting. Now, Mr. President, the expectation is that in the three component areas that I have just outlined, along with the verification matrix that will be elaborated, that there will be mechanisms and frameworks which will evolve out of this. This simply forms what we would describe as the vehicle for accessing the financing, and that the specific agreements signed within the context of this mechanism will become documents which are laid in this Parliament within 30 days of being signed. That, Mr. President, is again an indication of the accountability and the transparency mechanisms that this administration has committed to and is putting into every single instrument to which it ascribes its signature. Now, we expect, Mr. President, that the power to sign at Clause 6, it is a simple matter of the minister. This is nothing unusual. Implementation of obligations, which is the final clause, nothing unusual, Mr. President. But I think that the key and the most important thing that we would want to make sure that the Honourable Chamber is cognizant of is that this is an administration, Mr. President, that had a decline in GDP over the course of COVID as a result of the cessation in travel in the international tourism market. And so, Mr. President, it's an interesting thing that, just yesterday, we heard news coming out of the UK, one of our major source markets, for example, about the issues of congestion at Heathrow International Airport, for example, and Heathrow International Airport asking airlines to stop selling seats over the summer months through September. We have a scenario, Mr. President, where we also have had one of the major airline carriers that is used to bringing travel to Barbados also canceling over 10,000 flights to globally, Mr. President. That is happening with every single carrier globally as they face staff shortages, as they face challenges with crewing up, as they face challenges, Mr. President, with taking on new equipment and changing out their fleet. Mr. President, we are in unprecedented times where our traditional sectors are under threat in ways that we have not seen before. Mr. President, there are things that we always talk about in economic terms, external factors or exogenous factors. If there was ever a time, Mr. President, where there were exogenous factors affecting the development of a nation, it is this time, Mr. President. And so here we are, a government making a decision, as we have done on previous items of legislation, Mr. President. A few weeks ago, we made the decision that we would still be proceeding with road works for people in the rural areas because it is still important. Here we are, Mr. President, we're making provisions in terms of the labor environment within which we operate because those things are still important. We are still investing, Mr. President, in healthcare because those things are still important. We're still committed to education, and so we're expanding the safety net. Those things are still important. We're still ensuring that we maintain, keep up with the rest of the world, and that we are bridging the digital divide, and so we're still investing in digitalization. And we are a nation that has a long history of leading the way on sustainability, sustainable development, small island developing states, and our Prime Minister has been walking the length and the breadth of the global community, speaking in very strident terms about the importance of countries paying attention to the climate crisis. And so this is an administration that is now treating to innovative measures of managing debt by looking at new ways and new mechanisms to ensure that we as a country can still continue to invest in the things that are important to us and are important to our people, and in this instance, in the area of the blue economy and in the area of sustainability. Mr. President, I am very proud to be a member of an administration that even under difficult circumstances, even under dire external and global circumstances, we still find a way to ensure that the things that form a part of who we are and our core principles, that we still ensure that we put mechanisms in place to lend themselves towards future transformation of a Barbados in which we can all be proud. I am not going to spend a long time on this introduction of the bill, Mr. President, because there are those who are here who have a depth and a wealth of knowledge on matters relating to environmental sustainability, and who have been actively involved in much of the work getting us to this point. And so I want to be able to give them an opportunity to take the floor and to share some of the substantive work that has brought us to this point, and I will have an opportunity to respond and to share any further information a little later in the debate as I close. So with these few words, Mr. President, I now beg to move that this bill be read a second time.
Thank you, Senator Cummins. Senator Drix.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I want to say before I start, although this is an area that is very dear and near to my heart, I will not be long this afternoon because this bill is essentially quite broad in nature, and it, for all intents and purposes, is seeking to be a general legal framework by which the government can operate as it relates to debt conversions, or, you know, it's commonly known as debt swaps. But for the purpose of the discussion this afternoon, debt conversions, because I think it's a better terminology, Mr. President. But, sir, we essentially have a bill that, as I said, authorizes the government to enter into counter agreements with other agencies for various purposes, specific purposes, as it relates to a broad framework of sustainable development. Because when we talk about reaching economic, environmental, and social obligations, that is essentially what we're talking about when we're talking about sustainable development, Mr. President. And sir, through this debt conversion bill, what it does is it establishes the legal framework by which the government of Barbados can enter into a new type of financing mechanism, which is new to us, but it has been around since the 1980s. I believe Bolivia was the first country to utilize such a mechanism. But for us, it is a new mechanism, and it, in some instances, allows us to refinance existing debt. And through that refinancing, we can lower the interest rate. We can negotiate to lower the interest rate on some of the debt that we have. And it also extends the maturity of the debt. And in doing those two things, Mr. President, it allows us to have access to savings, because now, instead of having to service the debt in one way where you're paying higher rates of debt obligations, you're now saving that money. And that savings, Mr. President, then can be used as capital to make available for sustainability projects, as the leader of government business noted. Sir, and being a fly on the wall in certain conversations, Mr. President, I think that these types of agreements, if executed in the right way, can have some real implications for the country going forward. Because what it can do is make available financing to move projects that, by and large, will not have the necessary availability of funds to be deployed, Mr. President. And those projects would be projects that put people, Mr. President, and nature at the center of what we do. And what is particularly encouraging is that when you have these debt swaps or debt conversions, it is usually that you're taking or you're restructuring financing to external creditors, and then that the savings are then used in the local context. So there is an aspect of this that at community level, Mr. President, we have NGOs, non-governmental organizations, CSOs, and other community organizations, Mr. President, that can benefit from this type of vehicle. So it may seem high level, it may seem esoteric, but once the implementation starts, there are many persons and organizations on the ground, Mr. President, that can benefit from it, who, at this point in time, are cash-strapped, they're struggling for financing, they don't have the capacity to carry out a lot of the work that they want to do. And it is not that they lack the ideas, they lack the agency in some instances, but it is that they just simply do not have the requisite financing. And this, Mr. President, can be something that fills that void for them. So, Mr. President, it can be a catalyst for creating an enabling environment for what we would essentially know as the traditional means of environmental activism or social activism. But, sir, it can also move us into a space where we formalize social enterprises. Because if we are saying that there is a breakdown in the fabric of our society, there are social ills that need to be addressed, Mr. President, can we now have a discussion around a policy framework, a legal framework around social enterprises? And what are social enterprises? Social enterprises, Mr. President, are not businesses that seek, or their primary objective, do not seek to maximize profits, but they are based on reaching and attaining social objectives, and they work particularly with vulnerable communities. They offer goods and services to the community, but their main objective is social transformation and social change. So, Mr. President, I think there's also room now for discussion around formalizing social enterprises in Barbados, because the legal framework as it stands, as it relates to the Companies Act, we have nonprofit organizations and we have charities. So there is a nuance in there, because a social enterprise can have revenue, it can make profit, but it still has the characteristics of what we would usually call a nonprofit organization or a charity. So I think there's some discussion to be had on how we move forward with something like social enterprises in Barbados, given that the government, as we know it, can't do everything. And then we have a charity who is not legally able to go there and make money, generate revenue from goods and services. So then the question has to be, are there new mechanisms that we can implement or support, such as social enterprises, Mr. President, to reach our sustainable development goals? Mr. President, though, going back to the bill before the chamber, these types of arrangements are becoming very popular as countries recognize that we are facing a twin crisis, which is the environmental and the social breakdown that we're facing. And the popular instrument that we usually hear about are debt for nature swaps. Sir, and through a debt for nature swap or conversion, a nation or a country can cancel some of its external debt, as I said earlier, and use that savings in local currency to capitalize, as the leader of government business spoke about, these environmental trusts or even endowment funds to finance the local initiatives. And they're based on specific targets and objectives. And given the framework, or the multiple frameworks, I should say, that Barbados currently has as it relates to the environment and sustainability, there are numerous climate and environmental policies that the government of Barbados has, from energy to biodiversity, as we heard earlier, to the blue economy. So there's no shortage, Mr. President, by which this vehicle can be tied to the programmatic goals that the government already has, and can be tied to debt conversions in these counter agreements as we move forward. So, Mr. President, what I'm speaking of, it sounds very benevolent. It sounds all like a win-win situation. But like everything in life that is man-made, there are pros and there are cons. When I started to look at, there must be some risk associated with these types of agreements. And so there's an OECD report titled Lesson Learned from Experience with Debt for Environment Swaps in Economies in Transition. And that report outlines a few of the risks associated with these debt for nature swaps, as they're commonly called. And the report says that negotiating a debt swap can downgrade a country's credit rating. And it can also distort more favorable debt treatment operations like debt relief and restructuring, because the debt for nature swaps are long-term commitments and are sensitive to the macroeconomic and political instability. I don't think, Mr. President, based on our history, we would have to worry about something like instability, but we are in unprecedented times. But, Mr. President, I table that and I leave it there, yes. The deterioration, Mr. President, also of the fiscal situation can also affect a debt swap and can undermine the capacity of the debtor country to meet its obligations. But the last risk, Mr. President, is one that I want to highlight and to speak to, where the OECD report states that there is a risk that the revenues generated from a debt for nature swap could be mismanaged and that the environmental objectives may not be met. Mr. President, I raise that and highlight that point because we're living in an environment where we recently had the latest Auditor General's report. And if we are going to embark on these types of mechanisms where we're trying to reduce and manage the debt profile of the country over the medium to long term, and we're saying we're now going to divert savings from these agreements to local initiatives through various institutions, Mr. President, there must be strong governance arrangements and financial oversights of these institutions. Because the funds that are being utilized under an environmental trust, an endowment fund, whatever the mechanism may be, are going to be intrinsically tied to the arrangements that we have as it relates to our external creditors, or through international financial institutions, multilateral lending agencies, Mr. President. And going into those arrangements, they are expecting these commitments that we sign on to be met. So we can't have the mismanagement of funds, we can't have discrepancies, and the things that we are seeing coming out of the Auditor General's report in the provision of basic services, Mr. President. So there's a hesitancy and a caution that I place here, because we have to demonstrate, Mr. President, in very clear terms that there's a level of competency that we're going to enter into these arrangements. And it has to be that as we move forward, as we try to build out these innovative policy instruments, we get the basics right. We get the basics right, Mr. President. And despite all that is said or is contained in the latest Auditor General report, which I'm sure that the Chamber at some point may have an opportunity to speak to, I want, Mr. President, to stand here and to commend the work of the technocrats in the Ministry of Environment. Mr. President, the depth and breadth of work that some of those technocrats in the ministry are responsible for, it is absolutely astounding. It is a ministry that is sometimes overlooked, but the mandate that some of the technocrats have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, they must be commended, Mr. President, for keeping the ship afloat and allowing Barbados and allowing this chamber to even reach the stage by which we have a piece of legislation along with the Ministry of Finance, I can't forget them. But there's a relationship that I have with some of them in the Ministry of Environment, Mr. President, that we can reach the stage that we have this type of legislation reaching this honorable chamber. Mr. President, I am confident that those who are, because this is a situation that is ongoing, so I don't want to say too much about what is happening, but I am confident, Mr. President, that the persons who speak on our behalf at the negotiation table are competent and they are working for the best interests of this country, Mr. President. And I really wanted to publicly thank them for the work that they do that goes very much unnoticed, Mr. President. But, sir, there's also a level of care based on the observations that I've made in some of these discussions that has to be taken as well. Because we have to ensure that as we move forward and we change the way that people interact and experience the natural environment, that they are brought along. Because there's some things that are culturally embedded in how we utilize natural resources, the natural environment in Barbados. And unless you have the information adequately going out to stakeholders, the ones who are directly affected by these types of arrangements, Mr. President, you may fail before you even start. That is an outcome that could be if you do not handle these negotiations with care. And if we're also saying that we're going to divert funds to some local institution, agency, environmental trust, sir, it has to also be driven by and supported by the local stakeholders on the ground. Because people have to feel, they must feel that they are part of the process and that they benefit in some way. Because if you have a situation where stakeholders feel as though they're being blindsided, they're being ostracized, their concerns are not being listened to, then that then creates a vacuum, Mr. President, where you're trying to attain targets, goals, and commitments, but there's a level of apathy, Mr. President, that you then have no action happening on the ground. So you need the support, Mr. President, of those who are working day to day in these environments to have a successful debt conversion, environmental trust, endowment fund type of arrangement going forward. Mr. President, I also want to raise in terms of consultation, and I'm at the consultation phase of this because that's where we're at the moment. I do not believe anything has been finalized. So we're still very much in the consultation phase of it. And I respect that there's a level of sensitivity as well of where we are in this process. But we have to also recognize that as well-meaning as we may be, we have to all operate, those at the table, in good faith. And I say that because there's a balancing act when it comes to environmental preservation, conservation, and livelihoods, because people use the natural environment to create value, sell goods, services, and products. So they're using the resources that someone is now telling them, Mr. President, that no, you may not be able to fish here. No, you may not be able to do this particular activity here. And that in and of itself, Mr. President, creates conflict. And a really good example of this, Mr. President, has been playing out in the news, the international news recently. Mr. President, in the last few days, the Dutch government has committed to reducing the emissions of nitrogen oxide and ammonia from livestock farming. And they have some very laudable targets, but what we've seen from afar is that has not been met with open arms by Dutch farmers. There are massive protests happening because effectively what it is that the farmers are feeling is that the government is trying to take away their livelihoods. And that is why I say we have to all operate in good faith, Mr. President, for these things to work. And it appears even from, afar that the farmers were not included in those negotiations as it relates to those climate targets. Because clearly then the roadmap by which you implement some of the policies would have been different. There would have been buy-in from the farmers, and you would have been able to have a more smooth transition, a just transition as we call it technically, Mr. President. So if Barbados is to look around the globe as, yes, we move forward and we have to attend to the climate crisis, the environmental degradation, the unsustainable use of resources, it has to be in a way that stakeholders are on board and we provide a just transition, Mr. President, because if people are excluded and it seems as a heavy-handed approach, you're telling people what to do, when to do it, and how to do it, and it feels as though they're being robbed of their livelihood, Mr. President, that is when you create the social tension and the social unrest that we, Mr. President, that is not what we are about and that is not what we want. And it is something that I felt the need to highlight this evening as we move forward. But Mr. President, although that is a case by which we can look at and see what lessons we can learn, there are other good examples around best practices, as I would call them. Seychelles, in 2018, they were the first small island developing state to undertake a debt for nature swap as it relates to their ocean space. And I think, Mr. President, the model that the Seychelles used is something that we can look at in terms of how it was done and even the implementation in order to leverage some of the assets that we have to move forward in terms of protecting the ocean space, the exclusive economic zone that we have, as the leader of government business spoke about, and expanding the activity that we have in the blue economy. Mr. President, even closer to home, Belize, they have had a very successful debt for nature swap as well recently. And they now have an agreement that seeks to protect their barrier reef. On November 5th, they signed a debt for nature swap with a subsidiary of the Nature Conservancy, which is called TNC, to reduce their country's external debt by 10% of GDP. And Mr. President, what they were able to do is to basically restructure all of their external commercial debt, $553 million, equivalent to 30% of their GDP. And they were able to refinance that and issue $364 million in what is called blue bonds. And that, as I said, is a best practice that we can use. It's right there in the Caribbean. And as countries start to contextualize the instruments or the new policy framework through these debt conversions, debt for nature swaps, Mr. President, I think that there is a level of technical expertise in Barbados that I am confident that we will arrive at an agreement that works for both people and our natural environment, Mr. President, that is transformative. But, sir, I also still say that we must be vigilant, and I ask the persons who are involved in negotiations to continue to be vigilant, continue to have your voices heard at the table, because it makes a difference when your perspective and your interest is on the table when the negotiations are happening, because it is it is your livelihoods, it is our livelihoods that are at stake. And although many persons may feel like it is an external force that is dictating or driving the process, it is the initiative of the government of Barbados, because it is still very much tied to the economic objectives of sustainable debt management for the country as a whole. And sir, my final comments come to a clause 4 of the bill, which the Leader of Government Business spoke to, part 3. Because I think it is very instructive that this clause was included in this bill. Because many members, even in the chamber, when reading the bill, may not have the full context behind the intent of the bill, or what it is tied to. And clause 4, part 3 of the bill states, a copy of every counter guarantee agreement shall be laid before Parliament, as was said earlier, within 30 days of the conclusion of that agreement. Or if Parliament does not sit within 30 days after the commencement of its next sitting. And so I really want to commend the administration for including this clause, because it speaks to, and I'm going to hold the government accountable for this. I personally am saying it on the floor. It speaks to an administration that is willing to share with the Parliament of Barbados and wider stakeholders the details of these types of new mechanisms, these new financing mechanisms, because there is a lot of talk, as we've heard for the last couple of weeks, about where we're going in terms of debt management and the debt profile of Barbados. And what I want to say, Mr. President, is this bill, as broad as it is a first step. It is one of the first steps. There's going to be a suite of legislation that will pass through this House that is related to this bill. And Mr. President, I know that I will have more than enough time when those bills pass through this House to have a more fulsome debate on these issues and the new mechanisms in terms of the debt conversion that the government is seeking to embark on. And Mr. President, with those few words, I'm obliged to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Drakes. Senator Dr. Hanks.
Good evening, and thank you for acknowledging me, Mr. President. I'm really happy that Senator Drakes went before me, because now I can speak for a much shorter time, since she covered off a lot of the things that I wanted to discuss. But there is something that I want to discuss that she has left me some space to do so in a little more depth than I might have otherwise done. So, the Leader of Government Business contextualized this in a way for us, and I appreciate that contextualization. I also appreciate, as both Senator Cummins and Senator Drakes noted, that we will be able to see these agreements. They will come before us, we will be able to scrutinize them, and I think this is a really excellent step. However, I have to admit that I was so curious when I got these 5 pages and 7 clauses, because I was not quite sure what this was all about. What is it about? What's it trying to achieve or accomplish? And although I got the broad policy framework from Senator Cummins, I did not get much in the way of detail as to what this really is. And I have to say, I listened to the debate in the other place, and what did I get there? In the other place, I heard a lot about what happened for 10 years, how poorly the financial situation was managed, how awful this was. I understand, we know, because remember, all 30 seats we gave twice, exactly. So we knew all of that. So we got all of that, chapter and verse. But at the end, I still was clueless as to what this thing was. The only thing I got from this was debt for nature swap. Okay, so there's a debt for nature swap. Now, that's okay, because I know what a debt for nature swap is. So that's all right for me. But imagine the people of Barbados who have all of these questions about the debt that we are taking on. Day in, day out, people are asking about the IMF debt. How much debt is Barbados going to take on? All we can do is borrow, borrow, borrow. And we do not take the time to explain what on earth this thing is, because it would be very useful to explain what it is. Why is it useful to explain it? Because what this essentially facilitates is the conversion of our existing debt to other kinds of productive ways of employing our money for environmental purposes. Yes, debt for nature. But this is not just a debt for nature swap, because as I read, we're looking at environmental, economic, social, and other matters. So this can go even beyond that, which would be amazing if we can find ways to convert our existing debt. What I noted, I take notes all the time. So the last time we were here, we had a different discussion, but we were talking about debt as well. And I wrote down some figures. The debt to GDP ratio for Barbados as of December 2021 was 136%. And the expectation by the end of this year is around 120%. That's still high. And we are trying to get to a level of 60%. So what these kinds of initiatives can do is take some of this debt that we have and convert it into something else that is not debt. How do these things work? We were not told how they work. Why wouldn't the government explain to the people of Barbados who have all of these questions about the debt situation, how these work, and how beneficial they will be? Why did they not make a connection to the climate crisis that we hear about day in and day out? Climate crisis is hurricane season. We're going to have these storms that are getting worse and worse. Why was that connection not made so that people can understand that despite these 5 pages, this could be a mighty piece of legislation that facilitates so much in the country? And this is my source of disappointment. So although there is transparency, there will be transparency because we will be able to see these agreements. There was no transparency in introducing this to the public. And I am really disappointed about this. And when we talk about trust, people trusting the government, these are the kinds of things that lead to distrust, to lack of trust. That instead of telling us what this is about, you're going to campaign. When there's no need to campaign. There's no need. Tell us about our business so that we can understand it properly. So let me just say a little bit about what else I had to say here before I get too hot. Now, Senator Drakes noted that these are not new initiatives. She also noted that the first of these was in 1987. I have this in my notes as well. These are very useful because what these can allow, these debt for nature swaps in particular, is that you can exchange your debt for debt at a lower level. So first of all, there's a write-off. Part of the debt can be written off and then converted to local currency, which is really important too when we think about foreign reserves and the preservation of our reserves. And then after that, the agreement is that this saving you have on your debt, you will use this towards a conservation project or some other kind of environmental project. It could be a climate initiative, it could be something else. Now, these are the older ways of doing this, the bilateral ones which occurred in the 1980s, in particular across Latin America in light of the Latin American debt crisis. The current day iterations can be more complex and can include third parties. They can also include the purchase of countries' debt on secondary markets. So there's some complexity in there. And this requires a level of negotiation and skill, which Senator Drake spoke about. And like her, I am confident that we will do this properly because of how important it is. I'm saying this in actual confidence and also in hope that we will do this properly, because these things need to be implemented appropriately if we are to see the benefits. Senator Drake's also noted the initiative in Belize, which I looked at as well, and I think that this can be a good example, but I can't say that it's a success just yet because this was only November 2021, and like us, we have to see if Belize will implement this properly and ensure that they protect the reef. Developing countries face difficult situations. They have a lot of choices to make about where to expend their resources, how to use their resources. And countries such as ours that seek to provide a wide social safety net, to provide a variety of services to the population, need to find ways to use our resources appropriately. And this is one way that we can do this. We can free up some of the money that we are taking out of every dollar and paying towards debt to use to protect the environment, to deal with climate change, to deal with the many social issues that we face, healthcare, so many things we can use this initiative for. And I hope that the public will be able to appreciate and understand this. It shouldn't be getting this from me, nor Senator Drake's. This should be coming from those with responsibility for introducing this to the public. But I hope that people understand and appreciate that these are good initiatives. I also want to highlight some of the risks because I don't want to sell this as a panacea. There are risks, and Senator Drake's highlighted a few of these very well. There's one in particular, there are two that I want to mention. She noted the negotiations. These can be expensive and lengthy. I don't know the details about what we are negotiating, how far along we are, but they can be expensive and lengthy. There can be some resource use conflicts or challenges as well. And what we have seen is that in some parts of the world where, for instance, there are conservation areas or preservation areas that have been set up in places where communities have used the land for other purposes, so that there's a bit of a conflict here. And this particularly pertains to Indigenous people in some contexts. So these are things that we can bear in mind since these are not new. We have to take them into consideration, and we also have to take into consideration the sovereignty bargains. And I believe Senator Drake's touched on this to some extent as well, but I want to just drill down a little bit more. So just as we engage with the International Monetary Fund, and we want to ensure that we carve out programs that are homegrown and that serve us appropriately, we have to ensure that we don't get into situations where we allow some other entity to decide for us how we are dealing with the environment or with healthcare or whatever else it is. We still have to have a level of policy autonomy in making some decisions about how we do this in light of, as Senator King spoke about earlier, cultural context, knowing how we do things, how we use the land, what our particular concerns are based on the expertise that we have. We have it here, not external entities believing that they know so much about Barbados. So this is one thing that we do have to bear in mind so that we don't end up getting locked into some kind of environmental initiative or social initiative, an initiative to deal with crime, for instance, that does not suit us as appropriately as it should. So this is one risk and a caution that I offer. So in the end, I would like to say that this is a very good idea. I hope that it will, again, be implemented properly. But I really am not pleased with the level of obfuscation that came along with this bill, not just with respect to the people of Barbados, but even to this chamber, where I believe we would have benefited from some kind of explanatory note or something to allow us to understand what this was about. It is important for us, for governance, for the same transparency that we talk about, to go beyond the press conference and to explain things to people at the point of introduction, to provide answers, real answers to questions rather than non-answers, half answers, and campaigning. I believe these things are important. And I have some experience with non-answers since I have a question that has not been answered since the 29th of April, but we can leave that for another time. So, I thank you Mr. President, for allowing me to speak on this matter. You obviously have heard that I'm a little bit passionate about it. I hope to see some of the agreements coming before us, and I hope that we will all pay close attention to them so that we can assist in helping to carve out these very useful initiatives for the benefit of Barbados. I hope that we will get further information. Senator Drake's talked about this suite of legislation that will be coming soon, and this is a time frame that I am not comfortable with. That's what you're hearing, the Olympus, right? This movie is coming soon and a trailer. But I hope that we will get some time, time specific, because this is not the Olympus or the globe. We need to know when this is going to be happening. It may not be exact time, but ballpark, when and how, so that we can really be vigilant, as Senator Cummins said, and scrutinize these agreements to the benefit of the people of Barbados. Mr. President, thank you. I'm obliged to you.
Thank you, Senator Dr. Hayes. Senator Dr. Bradford.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Let me say that the matter under consideration is of great importance for the financial and economic development of our country. Senator Cummins, Senator Drakes, and Senator Hines, in my view, have done an excellent job in outlining the framework and some of the details and the risk that are involved in this kind of arrangement. These kinds of initiatives have been around for some time. In fact, I know of two countries, Costa Rica and Guyana, that have been involved in this kind of work in efforts that have to do with environmental sustainability and have to do with protection of their tropical forests. In fact, Costa Rica is one of the leaders, in my view, in this kind of initiative. The initiative, in my view, Mr. President, sets out for Barbados another instrument in our efforts to find financial resources to finance our development. Let me say that as a small island developing state, I don't think we know, and I don't think anyone can predict what it is going to cost to maintain the sustainability of our country in the context of climate change. I don't think anyone knows. And therefore, we have to be prepared to find appropriate mechanisms to address unknown costs that may come our way in the light of climate change. These instruments, or this instrument we're discussing today, is another avenue of potential financial support where we can exchange some of our debt for local financial resources that can support the green and the blue economy and provide appropriate financial resources for development with a greater environmental focus on national biodiversity, on response to climate change, on using the sea and our marine resources for food, and the promotion of a green economy that supports our food security. Mr. President, you will no doubt remember that in our last session, we discussed our Scotland district and the fact that we were borrowing a significant amount of money for the development of that part of our country. And I mentioned the need to have an agribusiness focus to that development so that we not only promote the conservation, but we promote the potential of that resource for the promotion of jobs, employment opportunity, and the creation of wealth. Mr. President, we need all the resources that we can have because to protect our infrastructure, to protect our coastline, to protect our beaches, to conserve our water going forward, and the potential of devastating climate events could devastate our country and create great havoc. But, Mr. President, as we consider the topic of debt, financial instruments, we must also consider the management of our public affairs and our public finance. The question of transparency and accountability raised their head once more. In this regard, Mr. President, I seek your indulgence to make a few comments on the most recent report of the Auditor General of Barbados. Let me begin by admitting that this is the first time that I have seen such a report, and consequently, in reading the same, I got many surprises. Mr. President, my first surprise came in section 211, which states the following: the audit of the financial statements of the Government of Barbados for the period ended the 31st of March 2021 revealed a number of material errors and omissions which rendered the financial statements unreliable. Mr. President, this shocked me. During my career, I had the privilege and opportunity to manage an international agency that had a budget of just about $200 million and employed 1,000 employees. The institution had an internal auditor, a firm of external auditors, and an audit review committee, all designed to ensure that the financial resources of the organization were managed with accountability and transparency. Mr. President, as the Chief Executive Officer of the Institute, when I was the Director General, I could not present to the governors of the institution a report that said that the errors and omissions in the report rendered the statement unreliable. Unless, of course, Mr. President, I was seeking to be relieved of my job or relieved of my responsibilities. To me, the people of Barbados deserve an Auditor General's report that is clear and transparent and that shows how public funds are used for the development of this country. And given the statement that the Auditor General made, I read the report not knowing which portions of the report was reliable and which portions were not. In fact, Mr. President, in section 212, I read the financial statements were presented to the Auditor General on the 31st of July. No, that were supposed to be presented on the 31st of July to the Auditor General were not presented until the 31st of December. The Auditor General's comment is that greater efforts has to be made to ensure that reporting deadlines are met if the reports are to be relevant and impactful for decision making. I believe, Mr. President, that those to whom public funds are entrusted and who are not prepared to report and account for those funds should be relieved of their responsibilities. In section 218 of the report, it is stated that the bank reconciliation statements held by the Treasury were not provided to the auditors. The absence of bank reconciliation statement contravenes Financial Rule 90 and is of concern that such statements have not been prepared for a number of years. The reconciliation process is critical in identifying arrears or unusual transactions in the accounts so that corrective remedial measures can be taken into consideration in a timely manner. In section 238, it is reported that $3.9 million in pension money were paid out in the name of deceased persons. Mr. President, the government has indicated that it will support 1,000 of our needy citizens. Let us use our money for the living and not for the dead. In section 3.9, the report indicates...
Senator Dr. Bradford, you're going, well, I hate to interrupt you, but I think you're going beyond the latitude in that this is a debate on the debt conversion bill. And according to section Standing Order 35, the debate has to be kept within that. So some segue into, clearly, your first point was substantive, which was if we're going to get into that arrangements, we need to make sure that all of our systems are in place, financial reporting and so on. But to justify that point does not need a point-by-point discussion on all of the aspects of the General's report. So I think you may want to just tighten it up a bit. We've gotten the point, make one or two more, but I wouldn't want you to use the rest of your time in another matter which demands its own substantive debate.
Thank you, Mr. President. I believe, Mr. President, as we speak of debt and as we speak of finance, that it would have been appropriate to bring to the attention of the chamber a report that was sent to me by the officers of the Senate, and therefore I assume that it was sent to me for my information and for my consideration. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to inform you that I had the opportunity to read the report, and I wanted to make a few comments on the report that was sent to me.
Entirely, I'm saying I'm letting you give a few, but we still have to, within each of the debates that comes before us, according to Standing Order 35, we just have to make sure that we stay within scope. That's all. So you can make a few more, but it is not the debate for that one in its detailed analysis. But once you stick to the general point of the importance of property and financial management to underpin the debt conversion bill, then it remains within scope.
Thank you, Mr. President. I assume, therefore, that we may have the opportunity to discuss this report at another time. Since it was sent to me, I assume that in the context of the communications that were sent to me, that I had a responsibility to read them and to comment. So I was just commenting on what was sent for my attention.
I agree with you, Senator. All I'm saying is that according to Standing Order 35, the comments have to be within the scope of the debate. So you can make a few more observations, but the detailed breakdown of all aspects of the report may not necessarily be germane to the debt conversion bill that we're discussing. No, that's what I'm saying.
Thank you, Mr. President.
So I'm giving you some latitude, but I don't want that we go too far down the line from the main body of the.
In that regard, Mr. President, I will summarize very quickly.
Yeah, please carry on. Yeah, just give you guidance.
I think,
as you're new to the process, I'm just giving you guidance because there is a limitation of scope on each debate, really.
I think, Mr. President, that based on what I've read, that there's clearly a need for stricter measures that promote accountability and transparency. And that the report that I read demonstrate that there are some loopholes that need to be tightened up, corrected, adjusted, and attended to. And as we see new instruments of financial support for our development agenda, we should be mindful of these loopholes. And we should seek in whatever way we can to ensure that public funds, either through debt swaps or whatever mechanism we may use to finance the development of our country, that transparency and accountability are central to the implementation of the actions that seek to make Barbados a better place. I'm obliged. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Dr. Bradford. And that's the way that you can link the two matters. Thank you very much for accepting the guidance. Senator Dr. Monroe-Knight.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, as I rise to support this bill before us, I'm minded to reflect that certainly the discussion and debate so far has caused me to think about the importance of our bicameral legislature and the fact that it provides for the country and its citizens to be able to participate in debate in two places, to hear concerns from different sides and different opinions. It adds to building awareness, it adds to education, it adds to fuller understanding. In the context of that, Mr. President, we've had over perhaps last month much conversation in this country. And I think that if we are fair, we would also suggest that certainly this government and its leader is not one that shies away from confronting the hard questions. This government and its leader has been known to engage the country and its citizens directly on the hardest of issues. Just recently, for instance, we engage in St. George Speaks, which is one of a number of engagements that we'll be having through various parishes and constituencies across the island. And a leader of another Caribbean country, on hearing that our Prime Minister was hosting a forum in which she was opening up herself and her cabinet directly to questions from citizens without any kind of caveats as to the nature of those questions, what they were about. took himself from where he was and said, I needed to be there in order to participate and experience the level of democratic discussion that was happening. And I say that, Mr. President, to say that the issues of debt are extremely important to every single citizen, and the fostering of discussion around the dimensions of it, what we do with it, how we finance it, are important conversations to have. And certainly, again, I am quite delighted that we have the level of conversation that it's having now within our society. And I say that even in the context of if it is unfavorable to our government, and even, Mr. President, as I experienced, unfavorable to me. But the fact is that a government that has the level of majority that we have is a government that has to listen, is a government that has to be reflective. And again, I believe that if we are fair, the record will show again that this government has continually attempted to engage and to be able to respond, and we will continue to do so. That is not to say that the engagement and the discussion around that has been perfect in all respects, but to say that we are committed to that engagement. The issue, Mr. President, of debt and the debt crisis is not one that only confronts Barbados. It is not one that only confronts the Caribbean or small island developing states. It's a global discussion, a global debate. We heard that in some countries there are riots and people on the streets. It is a global concern. And it is not just a concern for developing countries, it is a concern for developed countries as well. There are several developed countries that right now are contending with the issue of high indebtedness and how they will finance their development, Mr. President. Part of the reason why the issue perhaps touches us more in the context of Barbados and small island developing states has to do with the nature of our insertion into the global economy. And that insertion in the context even of the 2008 financial crisis has meant that where the crisis starts, not in the context of where we are, but in the context of the global north, that the impact filters down to us. It is about how we are inserted into the global economy. In the context of the debt crisis, analysts have suggested that we have now what is referred to as a perfect storm, Mr. President. We have high food and energy prices. We have global economic uncertainty in the context of the war in Ukraine as well, and also rising interest rates. And then, as well, for countries like us who have had to divert resources to deal with the COVID pandemic, we then have another layer in the context of that picture. So that the issues of debt are complex and that we have to be able to unwrap them and discuss them within a particular context. And certainly, the bill before us is attempting to provide the level of what we would call the fiscal policy space for countries like ours to deal with and address this issue of debt. Certainly, Mr. President, there are a number of lessons that have been learned, not only in the context of the COVID environment, but just generally as we attempt to navigate this issue of debt and how developing countries and small island developing states are able to respond in the current context. There are a number of lessons, like I said, Mr. President, that we've all recognized, and when I say we've all, the global debate in relation to these issues of debt. One, there's a recognition that traditional mechanisms of debt is not working for developing countries. It is that recognition that is fueling reform in the context of international financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, who are revamping their financial mechanisms because there is acknowledgement that in many cases, the strategies and policies that they are prescribing for developing countries in the context of addressing issues of debt are not working. The other lesson, Mr. President, is that concessional finance that comes sometimes in the form of loans have to be directed to addressing the fundamental social and economic development concerns of developing states. And again, Mr. President, you would say, well, that is obvious, but that is not so. If again we look back at the history of the international financial institutions and their interaction with us as developing countries, it was an interaction that was based on a prescriptive and directive modality where they wanted to tell us where the funds should go and what we should be doing in order to change and how we should be addressing governance. So that many times there was little space for us in the context of having to go to the international market for financing to be able to make sure that the financing that we received address our own identified social and economic concerns. And therefore, one of the lessons that has emerged is that those mechanisms need to be turned on their heads so that the priorities and issues are identified from developing countries like ours themselves as opposed to be imposed by IFIs. The third lesson, Mr. President, is that developing countries need a higher scale of financing that is released quicker. And that is important. The Honourable Member talked about the issue of climate change, which is quite vast and have multiple impacts. If we do not have mechanisms that are responsive and help us to address immediate concerns, then we have the possibility of facing disasters and then have the financing coming after. What is the use of financing that does not help us, as we talk about in the context of climate, to deal with issues of adaptation, Mr. President? And the fourth lesson, Mr. President, has to do with how do we build back better? And how do we build back better is speaking to how do we not just build back in the same context, but become more resilient. So then fundamentally, what is the nature of the financing packages? What is the nature of how we deal with debt management that is going to allow us to be more resilient? So that if we look at all of those lessons, it would have to lead, Mr. President, to the conclusion that we need different mechanisms, more innovative mechanisms that are more responsive. And therefore, this bill, Mr. President, is an attempt by the government of Barbados in order to ensure, as I said before, that we have that policy space, that fiscal wiggle room that allows us to be able to maneuver in the context of debt management. As we've heard, the issue is broader than just addressing issues of environment and climate, but the broader scope of sustainable development. But Mr. President, I hope that you permit me, because I do want to focus a little bit on the issue of climate change and the importance of ensuring that we have mechanisms that will allow us as a country to be able to address the issue of climate change. We have a situation, Mr. President, in which countries like us that are on the front line of the crisis. I want to repeat that, on the front line of this crisis, which means that we represent and are one of the countries that will face the devastating impacts of climate change, are not the main polluters. We are not the ones who are contributing to greenhouse gas emissions in a fundamental way. Our contributions are minuscule, Mr. President. But the impact on us is phenomenal. And the question that we have to face is, how are we going to finance the impact of climate change? And just by way of example, Mr. President, I want to remind, in 2017, Hurricane Maria in Dominica inflicted a staggering 226% GDP loss for the island from one single event. One single event. Estimates in the context of climate change suggest that we will see increased and stronger hurricanes, a rise in sea levels, longer dry seasons in a water-scarce country, longer dry seasons and shorter wet seasons, Mr. President. I saw a report recently that said that in the UK, that some 200,000 homes on the coast, some coast in the UK, was in danger of climate change, again by sea level rise. In the UK, 200,000 homes. We are all coast, Mr. President. We are all coast. Imagine that in the context of Barbados, in the context of climate change that I've described. Imagine Barbados facing a Category 5 hurricane. I was at a recent panel discussion, and one of the panelists, who was an academic from UWI, in discussing the whole issue of climate change and its impact, said very frankly that we are in danger, Barbados is in danger, if we don't address the issue of climate, of possibly becoming climate refugees. Of becoming climate refugees. And I'm not so sure, Mr. President, that we understood the very reality that Barbados, as we know it, could be faced. Barbadians who love this rock, Barbadians who believe that this is the best thing next to sliced bread and neighbor stringberry here, that we could be faced because of a climatic event to become refugees, that we would have to leave our country and seek refuge other places. And this is because, Mr. President, that we have to understand that the impact of climate is, again, and you know, I'm hoping that we will have another debate where we can have a fuller discussion in terms of looking at the issues of climate change, which I will not do fully right now because we want to stay on topic. But the impact of climate change is multifold. It will impact food security. It will impact infrastructure. It will impact health. It will impact all areas of our lives. And therefore, we have to face a fundamental question of how will we finance that impact? How will we finance building resilience that is needed across all of the sectoral areas where this will become fundamental? A Cat 5 hurricane that will devastate tourism. Mr. President, what will that mean for this country? How will we bounce back? How will we rebuild? And it is the search for answering that question that has led us here in terms of looking for mechanisms, again, that are innovative and are not the traditional mechanisms that will have us just paying back loans at high interest rates as well. I want to point out, Mr. President, that currently 15% of the financing to deal with issues of climate, even in the context of loans, that only 15%, rather, sorry, Mr. President, of the finance for addressing issues of climate are coming to countries on the front line of the crisis, while 75% of the poor live in middle-income countries that have been graduated from accessing concessional finance. And this is critical as well, Mr. President. Mr. President, I want to state that one of the reasons why our Prime Minister is often on the world stage talking about these issues is not just because our Prime Minister likes to travel. I mean, in the context, regardless of what level of travel you are, travel is extremely onerous. Yeah, it's not a pleasant activity. We again, on a plane, just to go see another country. It is because in order to be able to unlock these discussions, in order to be able to make a case for innovative financing mechanisms, we have to be in the spaces where the global debate is. And our Prime Minister is given leadership to this because she understands very much, intimately so, that for us, unless we are able to unlock these mechanisms, we stand the risk of not being able to have, as I keep saying, that necessary wiggle room, that necessary policy space that is so critical in terms of us being able to address this question of financing and being able to manage our debt responsibly, Mr. President. I believe that is what the citizens of Barbados is asking us to do, and we are responding, Mr. President. I want to say that even outside of the bill that is in front of us, in terms of looking at the counter guarantee, debt conversion and debt swaps, this government is also the largest issuer of natural disaster clauses. Again, Mr. President, looking for innovative mechanisms to address the issues of debt. And under these clauses, which include pandemics, once an independent agency has determined that there is a disaster, debt service then is suspended for 2 years and added to the back end of the loan at a rate of interest that ensures that no loss, that the lender will have no loss. So again, Mr. President, looking for mechanisms, looking for non-traditional mechanisms to be able to address the issue of debt while we balance our need to deal with the things that confront us in the context of climate change, sustainable development, natural disasters. And I want to reiterate, Barbados is one of the largest issuers, this small island state, one of the largest issuers of natural disaster clauses. The analysis suggests, Mr. President, in the context of the pandemic, that if we were able to have greater consensus, and even if that developing countries had these clauses integrated into their loan facilities, that it would have released $1 trillion for developing countries to address the COVID-19 pandemic, tripling the size of their fiscal response to the pandemic. Mr. President, I also want to remind the Honourable Chamber that just a couple of weeks ago, and forgive me if I don't quote that correctly, time is moving so fast, we had the visit here of the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund. And she came to Barbados not by accident, not because she was looking for some place to go. She came to Barbados because, as she indicated, that our Prime Minister has been a champion, again, for innovative financing mechanisms that the International Monetary Fund itself was responding to in the context of its Resilience and Sustainability Trust. to provide concessional financing that would be given, particularly, this is extremely important, that we made available to middle-income countries that previously would have been considered as graduating out from that access to those concessional funds, to be able now, in the context of the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, to again have access to that financing, which will be repaid over 20 years, and the IMF Managing Director indicated that this is the longest time that they have given in the context of IMF facilities for loans to be repaid, with a 10.5-year grace period for repayment, Mr. President. And she gave kudos to our Prime Minister for championing that initiative. One of the other things, Mr. President, that we have been doing as a government on the global scale is arguing for the recognition of vulnerability that goes beyond an analysis of our GDP as the framework. So that we have argued that vulnerability should be measured by the fact that a country can have the strong likelihood of experiencing a climate event that will impact 5% or more of GDP in one event. And again, that is something that we have been speaking to not only for Barbados, but for other small island developing states as well. Because if we can get the international community to be able to recognize and agree to that notion of vulnerability, again, it can help us unlock concessional financing. My final point, Mr. President, is that we not only have to ensure that we have the mechanisms and the innovative mechanisms that are there, because you can have a framework, and that's fine. But we have to be sure that those frameworks that are developed allows us, as I said before, to be able to access the financing without having to jump through too many hoops and quickly. Recently, and again a couple of months ago, I was in Copenhagen at a meeting looking at implementation for COP27. And one of the issues that was discussed was the issues of climate finance and developing countries being able to unlock the financing mechanisms that were available. And I was able to hear colleagues from the Pacific speaking to the fact that where there are mechanisms and financing mechanisms that are available, that sometimes it took almost a year, Mr. President, to get a concept note, not the project proposal, the concept note through. Do you know how many climatic events we could have in a year as you are writing a concept note? So that one of the other areas of advocacy that we have been doing in the context, Mr. President, of addressing these issues of debt and creating the wiggle room is that the issue of accessing, the issues of how these mechanisms streak to capacity within countries in order to be able to unlock the mechanisms, how they streak to the level of the onerous nature of what they require, then has to be taken on board in the context of the emergency, in the context of the urgency of the issues that we have to deal with. While we do not want to shirk our responsibility to make sure that there's a robust process, that there must be some attention paid in the context of how we access those instruments. Mr. President, as I close, again, I want to fully support, as I've heard on this floor as well, by the other speakers who have gone before me, their support for this mechanism as an innovative mechanism, as an attempt by the government of Barbados in order to be able to ensure that we can address the issues of debt management responsibly, Mr. President. I thank you. I'm obliged.
Thank you, Senator Dr. Monroe Knight. Her Honourable Senator Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I think that many of the presentations which have been made so far sort of wind their way naturally into some of the comments that I propose to make. I want to start with congratulations, as I did in my first intervention today, and this time for the transparency with which the government treated to the issue of laying in Parliament within 30 days any counter agreement so that the Parliament can have full oversight of the terms, and by extension, the public is aware of what the government is committing the taxpayers to. That is important because we have lived through myriad kinds of loans and loans agreements and rumors of loans and loans agreements and uncertainty about loans and loans agreements and fear of loans and loans agreements, particularly because we had reached a stage where we had a debt to GDP ratio of about 178% or so up to 2018, and then we saw it go down to 123% by 2019, and then rise again with COVID, where it is about 130, 132%. So the public has a fear, and I think that we are a risk-averse society, and therefore we have a fear of debt. Perhaps there has been a lot of entrepreneurship, but the reality is that a majority of Barbadians don't like debt. We fear it. But there is a nexus, when properly managed, between debt and development. That is so whether at the personal level or at the national level. For a majority of Black Barbadians, and perhaps for a significant number of Barbadians of other races, except within the Muslim community, where they tend to have arrangements for the sharing of capital and for co-financing and co-support for financing and investment, one would not ordinarily have, certainly not the one speaking, the kind of capital that would allow one to buy a property or a motor vehicle cash. You can't. You cannot afford it. Not the children of Black people in this country who are the descendants of slaves. Because when you work, you really, for a vast majority of Barbadians, you are 1 week or 1 month away from loss of job and everything that you have acquired if you lose your job. And therefore, putting yourself in debt, hanging your hat higher than you could reach, as Barbadians like to say, really is something that we fear, because we know poverty. That has been part of the cultural, the social, cultural, and social economic experience. And having known poverty, some of us are 1 or 2 generations away from poverty. You really do not want to return, and therefore you act in a very conservative way. And I want to say to the public that, as I made the point just now, there's a nexus between debt and development. That to develop, you often have to incur debt. That is true of the individual, it is true of the family, it is true of the nation state. The issue is not whether there is debt. The issue is whether you are paying 32 cents per dollar in debt or 68 cents as we were paying under previous administration. So that if your debt repayments are consuming your dollars, then you cannot develop. But if you reduce your debt repayments, as in fact you've reduced your debt to GDP ratio, if you manage well, if you incentivize your productive sectors so that your productive sectors are generating revenues and foreign exchange to meet your debt service, then incurring debt is not necessarily a problem. It is the management or the mismanagement of your debt profile and your debt service against your revenue and foreign exchange earnings that becomes the challenge or the difficulty. And therefore I say to the public, you need not fear, because to date, this administration has managed well against some of the most difficult social and economic and international circumstances that a government has had to face historically. This mechanism before the chamber, and others have spoken to it, is not a loan in the traditional sense of the word. It is really a form of innovative financing and a mechanism by which you sell your debt. The debt is purchased not at full market value, and the savings that you effect, you are asked to put in, in the typical debt for nature swap, which went out of popularity but are coming back, are experiencing a surge in popularity again. In the typical debt for nature swap, the savings that are affected or the revenues that are affected from the sale are put into particular nature-based solutions for environmental development and sustainability. This particular mechanism, at which the government of Barbados is looking on behalf of the people of Barbados, casts the net wider and goes from environmental to social to economic purposes for which these savings can be applied. And Senator Drakes was right when she spoke to the fact that if done properly, these mechanisms or this mechanism will cause investments in projects not only at the macro level but at the micro level in communities, so that small farmers in a community may be able to benefit. A group could get together and decide that they're going to invest in a solar farm. You may be able to do gully exploration and replanting for tourism purposes, so you bring tourists into it. You could have, do something in the nature of sustainable consumption and production by bringing in communities or bringing other people into your community to experience Barbadian culture and food. So you would have Barbadian and entertainers not on stage, as Senator John was telling us today, but performing in the community with aunties and mummies and people cooking food, doing other things. The landship may be there, Tukban may be there, so that you can have community-based activity and jobs and benefits being generated at the micro level, at the community level, to the individual, to the working class. So this is a mechanism that has the potential to unlock further development, to invest in social, economic, and environmental measures for the wider community. I am particularly concerned about the environmental benefits which could accrue to us. Environment is regarded as one, along with society and economy, or social and economic considerations, as one of the 3 pillars of development as defined by the Brundtland Commission and accepted now at the international level. I've spoken in this chamber before about the extent to which our future development is predicated on the protection of our environmental base. We cannot so overexploit our natural resources that we cannot sustain the economic gains or growth that those environmental resources produce. Already, we are seeing the impacts in relation to climate. where anthropogenic activity, human activity, whether it is flying, driving, digging up on the soil and not replanting or not putting in nutrients so that the soil catches itself. There are a number of activities that are affecting the level of carbon emissions, which is driving what we are calling the climate crisis. And since Barbados, like other small island developing states, such as those in the Caribbean, are on the front line of the climate crisis, we have to find innovative means of financing our climate response. And we have to do so because, as Senator Monroe Knight said, the reality is that we are highly climate vulnerable in the Caribbean every hurricane season and even outside of hurricane season, because we are prone to earthquakes, we are prone to volcanoes, etc. We can experience an event that is cataclysmic, that is a wipeout event, or that impacts 5% of GDP or more. Senator Monroe Knight rightly spoke to the impact that Maria had on Dominica, taking out 225% of its GDP. Hurricane Dorian took out 100% of the GDP of the island of Abaco in the Bahamas, and 30%, $3.4 billion of the Bahamas GDP. Hurricane Ivan took out 95% of housing and 150% of the GDP of Grenada. Hurricane Maria caused the island of Barbuda to be abandoned. People had to leave. So the notion of a climate refugee, and in fact, environmental considerations are now the largest driver of refugeeism in the world. So that the notion that Caribbean people could be climate refugees is not far-fetched. It has already happened. People in the Bahamas had to leave the Bahamas after Dorian because there was nowhere to live or make a living. People in Barbuda, well, luckily Antigua was the sister island, they could go to Antigua, but in Dominica, for instance, after Maria, children came to Barbados and young people to go to school. Sorry? Montserrat, the volcano in Montserrat not only has decimated life and livelihoods, but Montserrat has climate refugees living all over the Caribbean. And you can cite other examples. And when you layer this on the fact that the region is as water stressed and water scarce as sub-Saharan Africa, a region which is dependent on tourism, and tourism consumes natural resources, then you begin to understand why it is imperative that a government which cannot access concessionary financing because it is classified as middle income and well off, why a government that cannot get certain types of grants in the international marketplace has to find innovative means of financing its own development and crafting a response to the climate crisis which builds resilience at the level of the citizen and at the level of the country. So that our protection for environment relates to protecting agriculture and food security and nutrition. It relates to tourism. It relates to sustainability. It relates to resilience. It relates to replenishment of our soils. Issues like the exploitation of our resources. It is a critical component of what this financing mechanism is intended to do, and therefore is a primary shield and protector against the challenges and the development difficulties that we are facing as a nation. I am pleased to say that this response of the inclusion of these particular elements really again puts us on the boundary of making groundbreaking policy decisions. We did so when Barbados became the first country in the hemisphere to develop a green economy policy in 2007. We did so when we developed a Ministry of the Blue Economy. We did so when we developed disaster relief clauses, and Senator Monroe Knight spoke to that. If we had disaster relief clauses relating that included pandemics, for instance, or just disasters, rather defining them as natural disasters, during the pandemic, we would have been able in this country to liberate more than 7% of GDP and use for pandemic relief purposes. So this is part of it isn't just that the government is talking about becoming innovative. It is that the government is creating new ways to put financial mechanisms in place without crippling the country with debt. So the people, the taxpayers, need to understand what is happening. And I agree with Senator Dr. Hines, who spoke about the need for further explanation and elaboration so that the public can have clarity. Now, that is not only for those of us in the other place and in here to do, but it is for our public education and public information arms to break these things down into digestible pieces of information and put them out on social media. And I hope that if we do so, we will not be accused of campaigning, but we will be complimented for public education. We have to look at the issue of blue and green bonds, because this too is a way of raising capital. People in the diaspora are keen to invest in Barbados. There are people here who have access to capital. The reality is, as I said, I think last week or week before, COVID has made millionaires and multimillionaires and billionaires across the world. I mean, I did some research to see what were the companies, who were the individuals that had been made wealthy as a result of COVID. And it's fascinating. People who make masks and PPE, people who are responsible for Zoom and other communication platforms, people who are responsible for online recreational activity. There are a whole number of people who have really been enriched as a result of the COVID crisis. And Mr. President, sir, as my mother would say, don't doubt God. They got people out here who make a lot of money too. They certainly did. Supplying hotels and tourism facilities with exclusive concierge services for vaccinations. Examining tourists and so in hotels, going to people's homes and giving vaccinations and doing COVID testing, which of course there was a huge market for. In fact, it was, sorry? Hotels. The hotels made, but the interesting about it though, yes, the hotels made money too, because they charged a fee, you paid them, and then they paid some of the doctors and so on. But the doctors were not charging light for all of those that here who are part of the medical profession. The reality is that they were having the testing done, and in the government labs, free of charge. And applying the tests for hundreds of dollars. I confess that I made use of some of the concierge services myself. But the wider point that I'm making is this, that there are opportunities for money to be made, for innovation, even in the context of crisis. And if we put particular mechanisms in place, then we can be protected. There are a number of purposes since the legislation, I beg your pardon, the guarantee speaks to social, economic, and environmental. I want to suggest some of the uses to which a mechanism of this sort can be put. First, I would like to suggest that we need to be prepared for the next pandemic, whatever form it comes in. And therefore, I am going to ask government for the establishment of a pandemic trust fund to deal with any upcoming crisis or pandemic in the future, whether it is from out of an antimicrobial a challenge, or whether it is a pandemic that comes out of nowhere as COVID, as a novel coronavirus did. But money should definitely go into some sort of trust fund for the future. I think too that at the social level, we need to consider, and the member for St. Michael, Trevor Prescott, what, Southeast? No, that's not. East. For St. Michael East is constantly talking about an intervention in relation to men and something that will reduce the level of recidivism and something which addresses the level of violence amongst young men well, not inner cities, but what we call in the Caribbean, ghetto communities in urban Barbados. These are ripe for social intervention, and when we have external resources coming in, if we are affecting savings on debt, we have to look at saving our society, saving our people. That has to be a priority. Equally, violence against women, girls, and children is something that needs to be addressed. So that is another area to which we should give consideration, along with the investment in small and micro businesses, particularly those owned by women. And I say that deliberately because women often get great difficulty accessing capital from the formal system, from the banking system. It is a tragedy that many women go to banks and are still asked to bring their husbands. As a professional woman, I have experienced that, going into the bank, owning a building from which I practice law, wanting to buy a bigger building, going into the bank to negotiate with the bank, and being asked to bring my husband. And I had to say to them, I am a lawyer. I studied law. I have a legal practice. My husband has never gone into a law book a day in his life. What would I be bringing him in here for? And the officer and I looked at each other. Suffice it is to say, I didn't bring my husband and I didn't get the loan. But I was determined that either you were prepared to accept that I was a trained professional running a business, making money, servicing all my loans properly. And I didn't have no big lot of loans, sir. So I really think that insofar as micro businesses, as small businesses, and female-owned businesses still have great difficulty getting loans from the banking system, insofar as we want to create opportunities for those who are unbankable in this country, not because they really are, but because the banking system is so rigid, so rules-oriented, and owned outside of Barbados with no sympathy or empathy or understanding of the social cultural conditions of the country. In a country where mortgage default is lower than the rest of the world, you would still get hell trying to get a mortgage in Barbados. So I believe that capital, which is the fuel of the economy, has to be liberated so that Black people in this country and working class people and people with aspirations to be more than the circumstances of their birth, people who have an idea that want to develop it, that can do well. This is how Microsoft grew. This is how Google grew. A lot of these big businesses, these macro entities globally, particularly in the technology sector, started in garages, in basements, as micro enterprises. But you have to get the opportunity and you have to get the capital. I found it easier as a Black woman in the United States, setting up an account, a personal account and an account for a business, walking into a bank where nobody knows me, to set up a business than to walk into a bank in my own country and to say that I want to set up a business. You're asked to bring all kinds of evidence and certificates, but I don't want, Mr. President, sir, for you to haul me in, as you had to do earlier, but because I don't want to stray outside, I will return to the four parameters, the four lines, sir, of the boundary here, and continue by making the point, going on to another component of the point, which is, I know that this is a form of financing which is new to the public of Barbados, but as Senator Hines and Senators Hines and Drakes indicated, it is not new globally. These have been in vogue since the 70s and 80s. They fell out of fashion, as I said, and then they came back in. Countries which did the debt forgiveness included countries like Switzerland and the United States, Holland and Canada, Belgium, Sweden, France, and some of the beneficiary countries have been Angola, the Solomon Islands, Jamaica has been a substantial beneficiary of this form of financing, of innovative financing. The Maldives, I think, Bolivia, Egypt, Peru. So in Latin America and Africa, in other regions of the world, this is a mechanism which has been widely used, and it has been used effectively in small island developing states. So we don't have to fear, or the public need not fear, that this is some kind of new form of experimentation with the taxpayers' funds. This is an established mechanism for creating financing and bringing it into the economy at not even at cost, because the taxpayers are benefiting, they are not paying. It involves debt forgiveness, and then you take those resources that you would have applied to your debt repayment and you put it into development financing. It really is a very effective tool, and I'm glad to see that this administration is going to employ it. I was pleased to hear the visit of the IMF has been mentioned. I was pleased to hear that the IMF has taken on board the arguments of the Prime Minister and government of Barbados relating to the use of SDRs and special drawing rights, which is like a trust fund. I'm explaining for members of the public who may not be familiar with the language. Special drawing rights is a sort of trust fund that is available at the international level from the international banking system when there are emergency or crisis events. Larger countries have access to larger amounts of money, and what Barbados has been arguing is that, look, since you have SDRs to the developed world, since you have SDRs available to you, which gives you capital that you are not using, why don't you lend it to us for development purposes at concessionary rates over a long period for prescribed functions, not that you will determine the policy, we will determine the policy and what the investment will be in. But you would know, for instance, that the monies could be applied for natural disasters, resilience building, financing, climate change, engineering, to cite some examples. And speaking of climate change engineering, sir, I think that this would be an appropriate place to make the point when we talk about climate change has a cost. We talk all the time about climate change and we think only of it in the context of the increased heat. We don't see it in the context of the increasing habitats of mosquitoes, for instance, and the fact that that has an impact on disease. We don't think of it in the context of expenditure that government would not have to make would it not be for the climate crisis, and the diversion of capital from other development activity into either climate adaptation activity or climate mitigation activity. Barbadians compliment the boardwalks, particularly the one on the South Coast. Many do not realize that the boardwalk was not built for recreation. It was designed for recreation as part of an engineering intervention to stabilize the beach and the coastline, to help with sand nutrition, to protect the coast, and ultimately to help with beach and marine protection. There was a cost to that, a high cost. We built one on the West Coast. We did the South Coast, and so on. So that is exactly the kind of activity that a model of capital raising would finance. So that government does not have to look to its budget, but it can look to these savings and look to the financial mechanisms such as this to do our climate adaptation and our climate mitigation and the kinds of interventions that we are going to need to protect us in a situation where extreme weather events are increasing in number, in intensity, and in frequency, and where we are living in a region where we are regarded as the second most disaster-prone area in the globe, having been so defined by the IDB. And I go then, sir, from that to what is my final point. The issue of raising capital, particularly for climate change, mitigation, adaptation, and resilience building, is one which has to be an underpinning policy of all administrations in Barbados and the Caribbean because of the high vulnerability which our countries face. In that context, our international advocacy has been on point. And let me make the point that we are not advocating at the international level for some kind of paternalistic generosity from the developed countries. Our argument is clear. You are responsible for climate change and the worst of climate change impacts because of the level of your emissions. You therefore bear a responsibility to address it by finding capital to protect those persons whom you have forced on to the front line of the crisis. That's really what it is about. It is about accepting responsibility for action. That is what happens in civil law. It is what happens in criminal law. It is what happens in tort. It is what happens in environmental law. The polluter pays. And that is all we are saying, that the cost is high. You have brought us there. You cannot stab me and then sit down and tell me, well, Kadir, you look hurt. You better call an ambulance. Morally, who would accept that? And that is where we are. And the point that I want to make is this. If we are talking then about raising capital and innovative capital, we have to look at out-of-the-box ways of doing so. And I've indicated through the course of this speech the way the Prime Minister have spoken and Professor Avinash Prasad have piloted the whole issue of SDRs, the way we've done with the blue economy, the green economy, the way we have done with disaster relief clauses. There is now one more mechanism that I am suggesting we need to put on the table in the international forum. There is a mechanism at the international level known as RED, R-E-D-D, and RED Plus. Through it, countries which have heavy forest cover, because the trees sequester carbon, countries with heavy forest cover can access financing through bilateral or multilateral mechanisms and negotiation with countries which are huge carbon emitters. And they can then take that capital and put it into climate prevention activities or climate change prevention activities. They can put it into environmental protection activities. It is my contention, and has been my contention for some time, that since we know that the ocean is a very effective carbon sink, and that small island developing states like Barbados have a terrestrial space of 166 square miles, but 432 square kilometers, but a marine space, a maritime space of 186,898 square kilometers, that we should be arguing to the international community that our marine territory is acting as a very effective carbon sink, for which we should be compensated and for which we should be able to access a precise and determinable quantum of capital to pursue blue and green economy activities, because we are providing a global environmental service. In the same way that those with heavy forest cover can enter into bilateral and multilateral negotiations and get capital for the work that their trees are doing and for the environmental good which their trees are providing, surely those of us which are big ocean states, not only small island developing states in terms of your terrestrial space, but big ocean space, large marine territory, should we not benefit from the social and environmental good and the economic good and purpose which our ocean territory is serving for our region and for the world? And I believe that it is an argument which we now need to advance so that that too becomes an area of innovative financing for our region and for our country, in an environment where, because we are classified as middle income countries, we cannot get concessionary financing, even though our debt to GDP ratio is high. And even though we live on the cusp of a wipeout event, our GDP is still considered as the only criteria for determining not vulnerability, but GDP, for determining whether we should have access to capital. And Senator Monroe was right. Financing way after the natural disaster comes, when you don't know how much money you will or will not get because you are depending on gifts from people, does not make sense. What we need is clear, determinable financing mechanisms that allow us to plan our development trajectory and protect ourselves from the disasters and from the climate crisis, which is not of our own making. It is in this context, therefore, that I support this measure entirely and give that full support to the government of Barbados.
Thank you very much, Your Honor, Senator Thompson. Senator Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I want, first of all, to thank all of the honourable senators who have spoken. I believe in my introductory speech, I did say that I would introduce the bill, give the context for the bill, outline what the bill aimed to accomplish, but that I was confident that there were those in this honourable chamber for whom this is something that is a lived day-to-day passion. And so I wasn't a prophet, but I expected the kinds of contributions that I heard coming from around the honourable chamber tonight. And I think that we have been, very enriched by the contributions made in the first instance by Senator Hines. I think we take the point that this is, in fact, and I think I said this when I opened, a small bill with a huge impact. And we very much can benefit from the kind of public information that Senator Thompson made a reference to, whether it be by press conferences, social media, digestible bites, or any type of public information which the public asks for. And we provide it willingly and regularly, even though sometimes to do so in response to requests for information is described in different terms. But we have a responsibility to share as much information as often as we have it, and I think this is one of those things that we need to be able to do it on. Senator Dr. Brathwaite, I want to also express appreciation for your comments. I think they also were important, and Senator Monroe Knight and Senator Thompson gave a great detailed elaboration of the importance of the mechanism to the overall sustainability agenda for Barbados. I want to perhaps just close with a little bit of context again, just for the benefit of the Honourable Chamber. Mr. President, in 2020, when COVID struck, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, 18% of Barbados's GDP was wiped out. 18%, 1-8. And if we park that number, Mr. President, and use the example of it, I believe that Senator Drake's, in her contribution, she spoke about the number of countries that have used this mechanism for different purposes. And if we take into consideration the number that I just gave, 18% of GDP in 2020 wiped out from COVID-19. In Belize, Mr. President, one of the examples used by Senator Drake for this particular type of mechanism, it said that under an agreement identical to this, the TNC, the Nature Conservancy, lent funds to Belize to buy back $553 million in a super bond. This represented, Mr. President, a striking 10% of that country's GDP. You understand, Mr. President, therefore, what we're talking about in terms of wiping out debt, contributing to underwriting the environmental agenda of a nation, and then finding alternative mechanisms, as was described by Senator Hines, for converting debt into investment. Mr. President, this is perhaps one of the flagship measures of this administration to be able to treat to the question of sustainability while managing our debt effectively and in a transformational way without kicking that debt down the road to future generations, as has been a consideration for, as has been part of the conversation. So, Mr. President, I just wanted to put that further context on the table, and with these few words, I beg to move that this bill now be read a second time.
The question is that this bill be read a second time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that Your Honour do now leave the chair and the Senate dissolves itself into committee for further deliberation on this bill.
The question is that I do not leave the chair and the Honourable Senate resolve itself in the committee for further consideration of this bill. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Senate is now in committee.
Clause 1,
Madam Chairman, I beg to move that clause 1 stand part.
Question is that clause 1 do now stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
clause 2,
Madam Deputy President, I beg to move that clause 2 do not stand part.
The question is that clause 2 do now stand part. All honourable senators in favour kindly say aye. Aye. And those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
Madam Deputy President, I beg to move that clause 3 stand part.
The question is that clause 3 do now stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
And those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
clause 4,
Madam Deputy President, I beg to move that clause 4 do now stand part.
Question is that clause 4 do now stand part. Will all honourable members in favour say aye? Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
clause 5,
Madam Deputy President, I beg to move that clause 5 stand part.
The question is that clause 5 do now stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. And those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
clause 6,
Madam Deputy President, I beg to move that clause 6 do now stand part.
The question is that clause 6 do now stand part. All honourable members in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
clause 7,
Madam Deputy President, I beg to move that the final clause of this bill, clause 7, do now stand part.
Question is that clause 7 do now stand part. All honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
report.
Madam Deputy President, I beg to move that you do now report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee.
The question is that I do now report to His Honour the President the passing of one bill in committee. All honourable members in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. The ayes have it.
The chairman has reported to me the passing of one bill in committee. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do now be read a third time.
The question is that this will be read a third time. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it.
Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Debt Conversion Counter Guarantee Act 2022.
The question is that this bill do now pass and be cited as the Debt Conversion Counter Guarantee Act 2022. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. This bill is now so passed and cited. Senator Cummins.
Mr. President, I wish, first of all, to thank all honourable senators for having spent the day and the early part of the night here. It has been a long day, and I appreciate the contributions. I acknowledge that we were here from early this morning. We did one bill, and then in the latter part of the evening, we had a substantial discussion on the second bill, and I want to thank the honourable senators for their continued commitment to the debate and the conversation around leading the country and the policy process. I wish at this time, Mr. President, to beg the adjournment of the Senate sine die.
The question is that the Senate do now adjourn sine die. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. Methinks the ayes have it. Sitting stands adjourned. Sunny day.